All right, we are live from Occupy City Hall. Just going to do a test, make sure the audio is working right. This is our Rockford reading segment. This is the first Rockford reading segment of the second year of the occupation. This is year 2, day 2. We're continuing to read an autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. The autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. We're on chapter 11. Going to continue to work towards trying to do one of these Rockford reading chapters a day. I want to encourage people to come by the occupation at City Hall and pick up the newest pamphlet that we have released, the Culture of Impunity pamphlet, which goes through and speaks about some individual officers and some of the actions that those individual officers have been a part of while part of different law enforcement agencies in Winnebago County. So, Culture of Impunity pamphlets up here. We're gonna keep these downtown. Pull up and get one. If you don't have the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force pamphlet, pull up and get one of those as well. Email us if you like the PDF, and we're going to continue to, as we go through this second year, to try to regularly be putting out these pamphlets for people. All right, let me see something. Let me see. 1 second. Audio should be good. I gotta get the cord fixed on here so I can hear in these headphones. Really, I'm wearing these headphones just so people that's in the area can just keep walking by and don't try to talk to me, and so I can feel less distracted. I asked people watching. If the audio wasn't working, somebody would have said something by now. So we just gonna run it like the audio is working good. And this book is completely falling apart on us. Book's falling apart. The side coming off the seams and everything. So we're going to have to get another copy of, thank you. We're going to have to get another copy of this book. However, I do believe that this book being like this is a sign of us reading it, and it's a sign of it being used. That's what books for. Books are to be read, to gain new information, not just to look pretty. So we can always go get another copy. All right, so we're on chapter 11, Birth of a New Nation. The minute I knew I was coming to Ghana, I had a very deep emotional feeling. A new nation was being born. It symbolized the fact that a new order was coming into being and an old order was passing away. So I was deeply concerned about it. I wanted to be involved in it, be a part of it, and notice the birth of this new nation with my own eyes. The trip, which included visits to other countries of Africa and several stops in Europe, was of tremendous cultural value and made possibly many contacts of lasting significance. Struggling had been going on in Ghana for years. The British Empire, excuse me. The British Empire saw that it could no longer rule the Gold Coast and agreed that on the 6th of March, 1957, it would release the nation. All of this was because of the persistent protest, the continual agitation of Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah and the other leaders who worked along with him and the masses of people who were willing to follow. That's the section that I have highlighted here too. I want to read through that last sentence one more time. All of this was because of the persistent protest, the continual agitation of Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah and the other leaders who worked along with him and the masses of people who were willing to follow. And so historically, as we look back throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, we see how in different nations, in different countries, in different continents, in different societies, protesting has been used as a way for people who are oppressed to throw off the burden of the oppressors. But it is not from something that it's not from protesting once or from protesting twice. It's not from agitating once or agitating twice. It's from persistently protesting. It's from continual agitation. And I think that that's another thing that people don't understand is that you don't simply just protest to try to get people to agree with you or to try to get people to be on your side. Part of protesting is making business as usual no longer be occurring. Part of protesting is agitating these institutions, is agitating agitating these power structures to the point that they're forced to contend with the people that are protesting and demonstrating. And so I think that as we continue to read through this, again, one of the things I say regularly is that we don't just want to be reading through this to say that we read through it arbitrarily. We want to be reading and comprehending and digesting this information, and then finding ways to apply this information in real world practices for us to form ideology that is form an ideology that can help us in the furthering to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. So that day finally came. About midnight on a dark night in 1957, a new nation came into being. That was a great hour. As we walked out, we noticed all over the polo grounds almost 500,000 people. They had waited for this hour and this moment for years. People came from all over the world, 70 nations, to say to this new nation, quote, "We greet you, and we give you our moral support. We hope for you God's guidance as you move now into the realm of independence," end quote. It was a beautiful experience to see some of the leading persons on the scene of civil rights in America on hand. To my left was Charles Diggs. To my right were Adam Powell and Ralph Bunche. All of these people from America, Mordecai Johnson, Horace Mann Bond, A. Philip Randolph. Then you looked out and saw the Vice President of the United States. A handsome black man walked out on the platform, and he was followed by 8 or 10 other men. He stood there and said, quote, "We are no longer a British colony. We are a free and sovereign people," end quote. When he uttered those words, we looked back and saw an old flag coming down and a new flag going up. And I said to myself, quote, "That old flag coming down doesn't represent the meaning of this drama taking place on the stage of history, for it is the symbol of an old order passing away. That new flag going up is the symbol of a new age coming into being," end quote. I could hear people shouting all over that vast audience, quote, "Freedom, freedom," end quote. Before I knew it, I started weeping. I was crying for joy. And I knew about all of these struggles, all of the pain, and all of the agony that these people had gone through for this moment. Excuse me. After Nkrumah made that final speech, we walked away, and we could hear little children, 6 years old, and old people 80 and 90 years old, walking the streets of Accra crying, quote, "Freedom, freedom," end quote. They were crying it in a sense that they had never heard it before. And I could hear that old Negro spiritual once more crying out, quote, free at last, great God Almighty, I'm free at last," end quote. They were experiencing that in their very souls. And everywhere we turned, we could hear it ringing out from the housetops. We could hear it from every corner, every nook and crook of the community. Quote, "Freedom, freedom," end quote. This was the breaking loose from Egypt. The thing that impressed me more than anything else that night was when Nkrumah and his other ministers who had been in prison with him walked in. They didn't come in with the crowns and all of the garments of kings. They walked in with prison caps. Nkrumah stood up and made his closing speech to Parliament with the little cap that he wore in prison for several months and the coat that he wore in prison for several months. Often the path to freedom will carry you through prison. And I have that sentence outlined as well. And I think that that's something that has rang true since the beginning of time. Often the path to freedom will carry you through prison. And I think that a lot of times people advocate for freedom or advocate for liberty without understanding the historical price that has come linked with freedom, that has come linked with liberty. And the persecution of the oppressor has come with those things, and one of the instruments of the oppressor has been prisons, has been jailings, and I'm not sure how many people know about Kwame Nkrumah, and I'm not well versed in Kwame Nkrumah, but Dr. King is about to give a small little excerpt about some of the history on Nkrumah. And so I just think, again, even when whether you look in Africa, whether you look in America, whether you look in Rome in ancient times, when people are advocating for freedom or freedom of speech or liberty or some type of change of the current system that is the current order that is in place, prison and jailing is something that is a regular occurrence on that road. Nkrumah has started out in a humble way. His mother and father were illiterate, not chiefs at all, but humble people. He went to school for a while in Africa, and then he decided to work his way to America. He went to the Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and took his theology degree there. He preached a while in Philadelphia. He went to the University of Pennsylvania and took a master's degree there in philosophy and sociology. He always realized that colonialism was made for domination and exploitation. It was made to keep a certain group down and exploit that group economically for the advantage of another. He studied and thought about all of this, and one day he decided to go back to Africa. He was immediately elected the executive secretary of the United Party of the Gold Coast, and he worked hard getting a following. And the people in this party, the people who had their hands on the plow for a long time, thought he was pushing a little too fast, and they got a little jealous of his influence. So finally, he had to break from the United Party of the Gold Coast, and in 1949, he organized the Convention's People's Party. It was this party that started out working for the independence of the Gold Coast. He urged his people to unite for freedom and urged the officials of the British Empire to give them freedom. The officials were slow to respond, but the masses of people were with him, and they had united to become the most powerful and influential party that had ever been organized in that section of Africa. Nkrumah himself was finally placed in jail for several years. He was an agitator. He was imprisoned on the basis of sedition, but he had inspired some people outside of prison. They got together just a few months after he had been in prison and elected him the prime minister. The British Empire saw that they had better let him out. He was placed there for 15 years, but he only served 8 or 9 months. He came out the prime minister of the Gold Coast. I thought that this event, the birth of this new nation, would give impetus to oppressed peoples all over the world. I thought it would have worldwide implications and repercussions, not only for Asia and Africa, but also for America. Just as in 1776, when America received its independence, the harbor of New York became sort of a beacon for hope for thousands of oppressed people of Europe, I thought Ghana would become a symbol of hope for hundreds and thousands of oppressed peoples all over the world as they struggle for freedom. The birth of this new nation renewed my conviction in the ultimate triumph of justice, and it seemed to me this was fit testimony to the fact that eventually the forces of justice triumph in the universe, and somehow the universe itself is on the side of freedom and justice. This gave new hope to me in the struggle for freedom. And I want to, I had to drink something right before I came on. I think it went down the wrong pipe. Got my throat all itchy. But I think one of the things I want to point out is that just as Dr. King found Ghana, or hoped that this new nation would be a symbol of hope for Asia and Africa, the same way that in 1776 New York was a symbol of hope for people around the world or people in Europe that were oppressed. I think that we have to do the job of working to make Rockford a symbol of hope for people around the state and around this country that feel the oppressions and exploitations of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I think that that is one of the things that has fueled our actions with continuing the occupation of City Hall. It's one of the things that has fueled our actions with doing some of the live from Occupy City Halls and the Rockford readings, is trying to set a precedent trying to set a precedent in Rockford, Illinois, trying to set a precedent in Winnebago County on the lengths that people are willing to go to break the chains of oppression and exploitation that are tied to them from police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And so, I think that I think that symbolism, we can't simply only be struggling to create symbols or to build symbols, but I do think that all struggles do need symbols. So one of the things we're struggling out here for is for Rockford to become a symbol for the world around of people dealing with police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And it is a world issue. Wednesday morning, the official opening of Parliament was held, and we were able to get on the inside. There, Nkrumah, now the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast, with no superior, made his first speech. The Duchess of Kent, who represented the Queen of England, walked in. She was just a passing visitor now, like M.L. King and Ralph Bunche and Coretta King and everybody else, because this was a new nation. After Parliament was open and Nkrumah drove out, the people standing around the streets of the city cried, I got this book ripped right here. Standing around, my fault, let me try this one more time. After Parliament was open and Nkrumah drove out, the people standing around the streets of the city cried out, quote, "All hail Nkrumah," end quote. Everybody was crying his name because they knew he had suffered for them. He had sacrificed for them. He'd gone to jail for them. This nation was now out of Egypt and had crossed the sea. Now it would confront its own wilderness. Nkrumah realized that, for instance, Ghana was a one-crop country, cocoa mainly. In order to make the economic system more stable, it would be necessary to industrialize. Nkrumah said to me that one of the first things that he would do would be to work toward industrialization. 90% of the people were illiterate, and it was necessary to lift the whole cultural standard of the community in order to make it possible to stand it up in the free world. It was my hope that even people from America would go to Africa as immigrants. American Negroes could lend their technical assistance to a growing new nation. I was very happy to see people who had moved in. A doctor from Brooklyn, New York, had just come in that week. His wife was a dentist, and they were living there, and the people loved them. Nkrumah made it very clear to me that he would welcome any persons coming there as immigrants. I realized that there would be difficulties. Whenever you have a transition, whenever you are moving from one system to another, there will be definite difficulties. But I thought there was enough brain power, enough determination, enough courage and faith to meet the difficulties as they developed. When I hear, quote, "people aren't ready," end quote, that's like telling a person who is trying to swim, quote, "don't jump into that water until you learn how to swim," end quote. When actually, you will never learn how to swim until you get in the water. People have to have an opportunity to develop themselves and govern themselves. I am often reminded of the statement made by Nkrumah, quote, "I prefer self-government with danger to servitude with tranquility." I think that's a great statement. They were willing to face the dangers and difficulties, but I thought that Ghana would be able to profit, my fault, this book is ripped right here. Will be able to profit from the mistakes of other nations that had existed over so many years and develop into a great nation. After meeting Kwame Nkrumah, we stopped in Nigeria for a day or so. Then we went to Europe and then back to America. On a Saturday afternoon in 1958, I sat in a Harlem department store surrounded by hundreds of people. I was autographing copies of Stride Toward Freedom, my book about the Montgomery bus boycott. And while sitting there, a demented black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, quote, "Are you Martin Luther King?" end quote. I was looking down writing and I said, quote, "Yes," end quote. And the next minute, I felt something sharp plunge forcefully into my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed with the letter opener by a woman who would later be judged insane, Mrs. Izola Ware Curry. Rushed by ambulance to Harlem Hospital, I lay in a bed for hours while preparations were made to remove the keen-edged knife from my body. Days later, when I was well enough to talk with Dr. Aubrey Maynard, the chief of the surgeons who performed the delicate, dangerous operation, I learned the reason for the long delay that preceded surgery. He told me that the razor tip of the instrument had been touching my aorta and that my whole chest had to be opened to extract it. Excuse me. Quote, if you had sneezed during all those hours of waiting, end quote, Dr. Maynard said, quote, your aorta would have been punctured and you would have drowned in your own blood, end quote. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had sneezed, I would have died. About 4 days later, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, they allowed me to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital and read some of the kind letters that came from all over the states and all over the world. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. There was a letter from a young girl who was a student at the White Plains High School. It says simply, quote, Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School, end quote. Due to any extraordinary powers that I possess. Rather, it was due to the power of God working through me. Companionship in the struggle. I know no other way to explain it. It is the fact that in the midst of external tension, God can give an inner peace. As far as the repeated attacks on me and my family, I must say that here again, God gives one strength to adjust to such acts of violence. None of these attacks came as a total surprise to me because I counted the cost early in the struggle. To believe in nonviolence does not mean that violence will not be inflicted upon you. The believer in nonviolence is the person who will willingly allow himself to be the victim of violence, but will never inflict violence upon another. He lives by the conviction that through his suffering and cross-bearing, the social situation may be redeemed. That's the end of the excerpt of the speech. The experience I had in New York gave me time to think. I became convinced that if the movement held to the spirit of nonviolence, our struggle and example would challenge and help redeem not only America, but the world. It was my hope that we would remove from our souls the shackles of fear and manacles of despair and move on into the uncertain but promising future with the faith that the dawn of a new day was just around the horizon. The pathetic aspect of the experience was not the injury to one individual. It demonstrated to me that a climate of hatred and bitterness so permeated areas of our nation that inevitably deeds of extreme violence must erupt. I saw its wider social significance. The lack of restraint upon violence in our society, along with the defiance of law by men in high places, cannot but result in an atmosphere which engenders desperate deeds. I was intensely impatient to get back to continue the work we all knew had to be done, regardless of the cost. So I rejoined the ranks of those who were working ceaselessly for the realization of the ideals of freedom and justice for all men. I did not have the slightest intention of turning back at that point. Chapter 13, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And then I think one of the things that was a shorter chapter than some of the other ones we've read, but I think one of the things that stands out to me about that chapter is Dr. King's resilience, no matter what the cost may be, to continue and to persevere on in the struggle. And as I've said before, it's not a piece of literature that I have read in the past 16, 17 months that I've been involved in this struggle that I have not pulled some type of information from, or some type of wisdom, some type of knowledge from, that I have not, and I have been able to apply all of those things into practice, into to what we're conducting here, whether it be with the occupation or just with the struggle in general. And one of the things that, for me, I pulled from Dr. King heavily was his perseverance and his dedication to the struggle, no matter what hurdles arrived or arose. And so we read about in Montgomery his house being bombed multiple times, his friends' houses being bombed, the churches in the areas being bombed, and him not allowing those things to dissuade him from continuing on in the struggle and continuing on in Montgomery. And then we're just read now about him being stabbed by a woman having a mental health crisis, and him speaking about how once he was stabbed by her, he understood just how much violence had permeated the society, and he understood that even if he kept the nonviolent philosophy, that because the society had been so permeated with violence, that it was almost a guarantee that he would still deal with violence being enacted against him, but still staying steadfast in his philosophy of nonviolence, and still staying steadfast in his dedication to the struggle. And so I think that steadfastness and that perseverance is something that I pull away from chapter 12, and I hope that is something that other people can pull away from chapter 12. And I think that is something that, and I know it's something that we have to infuse in our struggle here in Winnebago County. Chapter 13, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. For a long time, I had wanted to take a trip to India. Even as a child, the entire Orient held a strange fascination for me. The elephants, the tigers, the temples, the snake charmers, and all the other storybook characters. While the Montgomery bus boycott was going on, India's Gandhi was the guiding light of our technique of nonviolent social change. So as soon as our victory over bus segregation was won, some of my friends said, quote, "Why don't you go to India and see for yourself what the Mahatma, whom you so admire, has wrought?" End quote. Hold on. 1 second, I done lost my page. Okay. In 1956, when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, India's prime minister, made a short visit to the United States, he was gracious enough to say that he wished that he and I had met. His diplomatic representatives made inquiries as to the possibility of my visiting his country sometime. Our former American ambassador to India, Chester Bowles, wrote me along the same lines. But every time that I was about to make the trip, something would interfere. At one time, it was my visit by prior commitment to Ghana. At another time, my publishers were pressing me to finish writing Stride Towards Freedom. Then along came Mrs. Isola Ware Curry. She not only knocked out the travel plans that I had, but almost everything else as well. After I recovered from this near-fatal encounter and was finally released by my doctors, it occurred to me that it might be better to get in the trip to India before plunging too deeply once again into the sea of the Southern segregation struggle. I prefer not to take this long trip alone and asked my wife and my friend, Lawrence Reddick, to accompany me. Coretta was particularly interested in the women of India, and Dr. Reddick in the history and government of that great country. He had written my biography, Crusader Without Violence, and said that my true test would come when the people who knew Gandhi looked me over and passed judgment upon me and the Montgomery movement. The three of us made up a sort of three-headed team with 6 eyes and 6 ears for looking and listening. And so on February 3rd, 1959, just before midnight, we left New York by plane. En route, we stopped in Paris with Richard Wright, an old friend of Reddick's, who brought us up to date on European attitudes on the Negro question and gave us a taste of the best French cooking. We missed our plane connection in Switzerland because of fog and arrived in India after a roundabout tour 2 days late. But from the time we came down out of the clouds at Bombay on February 10th until March 10th, when we waved goodbye at the New Delhi airport, we had one of the most concentrated and eye-opening experiences of our lives. We had a grand reception in India. The people showered upon us the most generous hospitality imaginable. Almost every door was open so that our party was able to see some of India's most important social experiments and talk with leaders in and out of government, ranging from Prime Minister Nehru to village councilman and Vinoba Bhave, the sainted leader of the land reform movement. Since our pictures were in the newspapers very often, it was not unusual for us to be recognized by crowds in public places and on public conveniences. Occasionally, I would take a morning walk in the large cities, and out of the most expected places, someone would emerge and ask, quote, "Are you Martin Luther King Jr.?" End quote. We had hundreds of invitations that the limited time did not allow us to accept. We were looked upon as brothers, with the color of our skins as something of an asset. But the strongest bond of fraternity was the common cause of minority and colonial peoples in America, Africa, and Asia struggling to throw off racism and imperialism. We had the opportunity to share our views with thousands of Indian people through endless conversations and numerous discussion sessions. I spoke before university groups and public meetings all over India. Because of the keen interest that the Indian people have in the race problem, these meetings were usually packed. Occasionally, interpreters were used, but on the whole, I spoke to audiences that understood English. The Indian people loved to listen to the Negro spirituals. Therefore, Coretta ended up singing as much as I lectured. We discovered that autograph seekers are not confined to America. After appearances in public meetings and while visiting villages, we were often besieged for autographs. Even while riding planes, more than one pilot came into the cabin from the cockpit requesting our signatures. We got good press throughout our stay. Thanks to the Indian papers, the Montgomery bus boycott was already well known in that country. Indian publications perhaps gave a better continuity of our 381-day bus strikes than did most of our papers in the United States. We held press conferences in all of the larger cities, Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, and talked with newspapermen almost everywhere we went. They asked sharp questions and at times appeared to be hostile, but that was just their way of bringing out the story that they were after. As reporters, they were scrupulously fair with us and in their editorials showed an amazing grasp of what was going on in America and other parts of the world. And so at this point, and this is, I sort of want to speak about the importance of the importance of understanding okay, so I was sort of looking for a phrase to capture this, and I can't find a phrase. So let me just try to break it down in specifics. The Montgomery bus boycott is what got Martin Luther King Jr. to prominence, what rose him to prominence, what rose the SCLC to prominence, and what helped to rise the movement to end the Southern segregation to prominence. But I think it's important to note that it was a grassroots movement. It was very specific to the issues that were locally taking place in Montgomery, and to very specific issues in Montgomery, the segregation of the buses, the treatment that black people got because of the segregation of the buses, and it was the people within Montgomery who were the ones who were enacting this struggle, the ones who were the key players in this struggle. But because of the dedication and the perseverance that they had in that grassroots struggle, in that local struggle, in that struggle that was not a nationwide issue or a nationwide story, it rose to become a nationwide story. It rose to become a nationwide issue, and then even surpassing just being a nationwide issue, as we're reading out here, it became a global issue, to the point where Dr. King, who was an organizer in this local grassroots movement, would be invited to Ghana, be invited to India. He would have stories about what was going on in Montgomery, Alabama, be printed in the newspapers in India. And so I do believe that part of, but I know that we will not be able to wage the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice only on a local level. In order for us to truly end those things, it must become a national and then a global mass movement, a global issue. However, to ensure that the integrity of it is intact, to ensure that there are tangible changes that come, we must focus on the local issues, on the grassroots issues, on organically organizing and organically mobilizing, with the understanding and the faith and the belief that doing that at the highest level possible, doing that with as much dedication and determination possible, will get us to a place where it becomes a national issue, it becomes a global issue, and at that point reinforcements will come in to help us break down the last chains of some of these things. And so I just think that that's something important to point out, that even though right now we're reading about Dr. King in India, in the last chapter we read about Dr. King in Ghana, all of these things happened because in chapters prior to this we read about the dedication and passion that Dr. King showed in Montgomery, that the people in Montgomery showed in Montgomery. And so I think that's something I would like to point out. India is a vast country with vast problems. We flew over the long stretches from north to south, east to west. We took trains for shorter jumps and used automobiles and jeeps to get us into the less accessible places. Everywhere we went, we saw crowded humanity, on the roads, in the city streets and squares, even in the villages. Most of the people were poor and poorly dressed. In the city of Bombay, for example, over 500,000 people, mostly unattached, unemployed, or partially employed males, slept out of doors every night. Great ills flowed from the poverty of India, but strangely, there was relatively little crime. This was another concrete manifestation of the wonderful spiritual quality of the Indian people. They were poor, jammed together, and half-starved, but they did not take it out on each other. My fault, y'all. I'm trying to check something. Okay. In contrast to the poverty-stricken, there were Indians who were rich, had luxurious homes, landed estates, fine clothes, and showed evidence of overeating. The bourgeois, white, black, or brown, behaves about the same the world over. India's leaders, in and out of government, were conscious of their country's other great problems and were heroically grappling with them. The country seemed to The country seemed to be divided. Some said that India should become westernized and modernized as quickly as possible so that she might raise her standards of living. On the other hand, there were others, perhaps the majority, who said that westernization would bring with it the evils of materialism, cutthroat competition, and rugged individualism. They said that India would lose her soul if she took to chasing Yankee dollars, and that big machine would only raise the living standards of the comparatively few workers who got jobs, but the greater number of people would be displaced. Prime Minister Nehru, at once an intellectual and a man charged with the practical responsibility of heading the government, seemed to steer a middle course between these extreme attitudes. In our talks with him, he indicated that he felt that some industrialization was absolutely necessary, that there were some things that only big or heavy industry could do for the country, but that if the state kept a watchful eye on the developments, most of the pitfalls might be avoided. At the same time, Mr. Nehru gave support to the movement that would encourage and expand the handicraft arts such as spinning and weaving in homes and villages, and thus leave as much economic self-help and autonomy as possible to the local community. That night, we had dinner with Prime Minister Nehru. With us as a guest was Lady Mountbatten, the wife of Lord Mountbatten, who was Viceroy of India when it received its independence. They were lasting friends only because Gandhi followed the way of love and nonviolence. The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community, so that when the battle was over, a new relationship comes into being between the oppressed and the oppressor. There was a great movement in India that is almost unknown in America. At its center was the campaign for land reform known as Bhudan. It would solve India's great economic and social change by consent, not by force. The Bhudanists were led by the sainted Vinabo Bhavi and Jayaprakash Narayan, a highly sensitive intellectual who was trained in American colleges. Excuse me if I'm butchering those names, I'm sorry. Their ideal was the self-sufficient village. Their program envisioned persuading the large landowners to give up some of their holdings to landless peasants, persuading small landowners to give up their individual ownership for common cooperative ownerships by the villages, and encouraging farmers and villagers to spin and weave for the cloth for their own clothes during their spare time from their agricultural pursuits. Since these measures would answer the questions of employment, food, and clothing, the village could then, through cooperative action, make just about everything that it would need or get it through barter or exchange from other villages. Accordingly, each village would be virtually self-sufficient and would thus free itself from the domination of the urban centers that were like evil lodestones, drawing the people away from the rural areas, concentrating them in city slums, and debauching them of their urban vices. At least this was the argument of the Buddhists and other Gandhians. Such ideas sound strange and archaic to Western ears. However, the Indians have already achieved greater results than we Americans would ever expect. For example, millions of acres of land have been given up by rich landlords, and additional millions of acres have been given up to cooperative management by small farmers. On the other hand, the Buddhists shrink from giving their movement the organization and drive that we in America would venture to guess that it must have in order to keep pace with the magnitude of the problems that everybody is trying to solve. It would be a boon to democracy if one of the great nations of the world, with almost 400 million people, proves that it is possible to provide a good living for everyone without surrendering to a dictatorship of either, quote, the right, end quote, or, quote, left, end quote. India is a tremendous force for peace and nonviolence at home and abroad. It is a land where the idealist and the intellectual are yet respected. We should want to help India preserve her soul and thus help to save our own. On February 22nd, Mrs. King and I journeyed down to a city in India called Triumvirdum. Then we went from Triumvirdum down to a point known as Cape Comorin. This is where the mass of India ends and the vast rolling waters of the ocean have their beginning. It is one of the most beautiful parts of all the world. 3 great bodies of water meet together in all of their majestic splendor: the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. I remember how we went out there and looked at the big old rocks, a sight that was truly incredible, out into the waters, out into the ocean. Seated on a huge rock that slightly protruded into the ocean, we were enthralled by the vastness of the ocean and its terrifying immensities. We looked at the waves of those great bodies of water as they unfolded in almost rhythmic suspension. As the waves crashed against the base of the rock on which we were seated, an oceanic music brought sweetness to the ear. To the west we saw the magnificent sun, a red cosmic ball of fire, appear to sink into the very ocean itself. Just as it was almost lost from sight, Coretta touched me and said, quote, "Look, Martin, isn't that beautiful?" End quote. I looked around and saw the moon, another ball of scintillating beauty. As the sun appeared to be sinking into the ocean, the moon appeared to be rising from the ocean. When the sun finally passed completely beyond sight, darkness engulfed the earth, but in the east, the radiant light of the rising moon shone supreme. This was, as I said, one of the most beautiful parts in all the world, and that happened to be one of those days when the moon was full. This is one of the few points in all the world where you can see the setting of the sun and the rising of the moon simultaneously. I looked at that and something came to mind, and I had to share it with Coretta, Dr. Reddick, and other people who were accompanying us around at that point. We have experiences when the light of day vanishes, leaving us in some dark and desolate midnight, moments when our highest hopes are turned into shambles of desperation, or when we are victims of some tragic and some terrible exploitation. During such moments, our spirits are almost overcome by gloom and despair, and we feel that there is no light anywhere. But ever again, we look toward the east and discover that there is another light which shines even in the darkness, and, quote, the spear of frustration, end quote, is transformed, quote, into a shaft of light, end quote. On March 1st, we had the privilege of spending a day at the Ahmedabad Ashram, and stood there at the point where Gandhi started his walk of 218 miles to a place called Bambi. He started there walking with 8 people. Gradually, the number grew to millions and millions. Gandhi went on and reached down in the river and brought up a little salt in his hands to demonstrate and dramatize the fact that they were breaking this law in protest against the injustices they have faced over all the years with these salt laws. And Gandhi said to his people, quote, "If you are hit, don't hit back. If they shoot you, don't shoot back. If they curse you, don't curse back. Just keep moving. Some of us might have to die before we get there. Some of us might be thrown in jail before we get there, but let's just keep moving," end quote. And they kept moving and walked, and millions of them came together. Gandhi was able to mobilize and galvanize more people in his lifetime than any other person in the history of this world. And just with a little love and understanding, goodwill, and a refusal to cooperate with an evil law, he was able to break the backbone of the British Empire. This, I think, was one of the most significant things that ever happened in the history of the world. More than 390 million people achieved their freedom, and they achieved it non-violently. I was delighted that the Gandhians accepted us with open arms. They praised our experiment with the nonviolent resistance technique at Montgomery. They seemed to look upon it as an outstanding example of the possibilities of its use in Western civilization. To them, as to me, it also suggested that nonviolent resistance, when planned and positive in action, could work effectively even under totalitarian regimes. We argued this point at some length with the groups of African students who were studying in India. They felt that nonviolent resistance could only work in a situation where the resistors had a potential ally in the conscience of the opponent. We soon discovered that they, like many others, tended to confuse passive resistance with non-resistance. This is completely wrong. True nonviolent resistance is not unrealistic submission to evil power. It is rather a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love, in the faith that it is better to be the recipient of violence than the inflictor of it, since the latter only multiplies the existence of violence and bitterness in the universe, while the former may develop a sense of shame in the opponent and thereby bring about a transformation and change of heart. And it's not that I don't agree with this philosophical statement or this ideological statement, but again, one of the things that I believe it's important for us to do as we're reading these things, and I have tried to do the job of doing as I'm reading these things, is sort of translating these concepts over to where it is that we stand at now in our struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. And I think that one of the things that I've repeatedly said is that our number one job right now is to bring awareness to these issues. Our number one job is to alter the consciousness of the community and bring these issues to the forefront of that consciousness instead of allowing them to be so far at the back of the consciousness of the community. And in doing that, nonviolent resistance has been our main philosophy, our main ideology, one of our main tactics, nonviolent resistance. And again, nonviolent resistance is not an unrealistic submission to power, to evil power. And so for me, when I think about the importance of nonviolent resistance, trying to use some of the concepts that Dr. King just wrote, the reason that nonviolent resistance is useful for what it is that we are doing is because when these institutions of violence and these institutions, whether it be the Rockford Police Department or the Winnebago County Sheriff Deputies or the state's attorney or even the city of Rockford government, when they implement some of their violent tactics or when they implement some of their unjust tactics, because of the platform that we have built, when these things happen to us, it elevates these actions. It makes more people aware of these actions. More people see these actions. And so that gets more people to know that these things go on, to know that these things happen. And then even within there, and then for an example, There's been times where every time that I've been arrested, by the time that I get out of jail, I have more, and everything is not solely social media. I'm just using social media as a medium for this example right now, because it's more tangible than word of mouth and things of that nature. But every time I get out of jail, I have a bevy of new friend requests. I have a bevy of new people who are sharing new posts, and there's different people in the community sharing the post of me being arrested or the video of me being arrested, and there's different people in the community that become up in arms or become at least vocal on social media about these things. There are a lot of times older videos from the past get watched and older posts from the past get seen and get shared. And so and this again, giving an example, if for some reason being arrested by these police officers, for some people, they may see that as non-resistance because I don't resist the arrest, or because I don't stop the arrest, or because I don't have a violent altercation with the arrest. But for me, I still see that as a non-violent resistance, because anything that I have been arrested doing, I have done and have had the right to do. And after I've been arrested for doing those things, because I have not been found guilty of doing these things in a court of law, I return back to those things. I've been arrested for writing in chalk, and I've returned back to writing chalk. I've been arrested for protesting memorials being torn down, and I've protested memorials being torn down again afterwards, and put memorials back up again afterwards. I've been arrested for being at City Hall, and I returned back to City Hall. And each time that cycle of unjust arrest, and then returning back to continue the action that precipitated the unjust arrest happens, more people become aware of the unjustness that exists in this community, exists in this society. And so I believe that is doing the work of resisting. That is doing the work of non-violently resisting. And so I don't think that we're necessarily in this moment of the struggle working to have a transformation and a change of heart in individuals, but more working to have a transformation and a change of consciousness in the community, in the society. And that does not mean that for example, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, he changed the consciousness of football. He changed the society, altered the society of that the NFL and football was in. And it doesn't mean that everybody went over to his side, or that everybody agreed with him, or even that the majority of people agreed with him, or the majority of people took the same action that he took. But because of the tactics and the strategy that he implemented in his action, he was able to successfully put this issue at the forefront of the consciousness, and that is the sort of the same type of thing that we are doing here. And then eventually, once you have this issue at the forefront of the consciousness, I do believe that then it becomes incumbent upon other organizations or other collectives to try to do the work of trying to gain people on their side, or trying to get people to agree with or change their heart, have a change of heart in some way. But I don't believe that we are there yet, and I believe it's a danger in trying to fast forward the step of raising awareness, of changing the consciousness of the society. We went in some little villages, and in these villages, we saw hundreds of people sleeping on the ground. They didn't have any beds to sleep in. There was no running water there, nothing to wash with. We looked in these villages and we saw people there in their little huts and their little rooms, and their cows slept in the same room with them. If they had a few chickens, the chickens slept in the same room with them. We looked at these people. They had nothing that we would consider convenient, none of the comforts of life. Here they were, sleeping in the same room with the beast of the field. This was all they had. Pretty soon we discovered that these people were the untouchables. This caste system had existed for years. These were the people who worked hardest, and they were trampled over even by the Indian people themselves. Gandhi looked at this system and couldn't stand it. He looked at his people and said, quote, "Now you have selected me, and you've asked me to free you from the political domination and economic exploitation inflicted upon you by Britain, and here you are, trampling over and exploiting 70 million of your brothers," end quote. And he decided that he would never, ever adjust to that system, and that he would speak against it and stand up against it for the rest of his life. The first thing he did was to adopt an untouchable girl as his daughter. His wife, a member of the high caste, thought he was going crazy. She said, quote, What in the world are you doing adopting an untouchable? We are not supposed to touch these people, end quote. And he said, quote, I am going to have this young lady as my daughter, end quote. He brought her into his ashram and she lived there. He demonstrated in his own life that untouchability had to go. One day, Mahatma Gandhi stood before his people and said, quote, you are exploiting these untouchables. Even though we are fighting with all that we have of our bodies and our souls to break loose from the bondage of the British Empire, we are exploiting these people and we are taking them from their selfhood and their self-respect, end quote. He said, quote, I will refuse to eat until the leaders of the caste system will come to me with the leaders of the untouchables and say that there will be an end to untouchability and the Hindu temples of India will open their doors to the untouchables, end quote. And he refused to eat, in days past. Finally, when Gandhi was about to breathe his last breath and his body was all but gone, a group from the untouchables and a group from the Brahmin caste came to him and signed a statement saying that they would no longer adhere to the caste system. The priest of the temple came to him and said, quote, now the temples will be open to the untouchables, end quote. That afternoon, untouchables from all over India went into the temples, and all of those thousands of millions of people put their arms around the Brahmins and people of other castes. Hundreds of millions of people who had never touched each other for 2,000 years were now singing and praising all together. This was a great contribution that Mahatma Gandhi brought about. India appeared to be integrating its untouchables faster than the United States was integrating its Negro minority. Both countries had federal laws against discrimination, but in India, the leaders of the government, of religious, educational, and other institutions had publicly endorsed the integration laws. The Prime Minister admitted to me that many Indians still harbored a prejudice against these long oppressed people, but that it had become unpopular to exhibit this prejudice in any form. In part, this change in climate was created through the moral leadership of the late Mahatma Gandhi. In part, it was the result of the Indian Constitution, which specified that discrimination against the untouchables is a crime, punishable by imprisonment. The Indian government spent millions of rupees annually developing housing and job opportunities in villages heavily inhabited by untouchables. Moreover, the Prime Minister said, if two applicants compete for entrance into a college or university, one of the applicants being an untouchable and the other of high caste, the school is required to accept the untouchable. Professor Lawrence Reddick, who was with me during the interview, asked, quote, but isn't that discrimination, end quote? Quote, well, it may be, end quote, the Prime Minister answered, quote, but this is our way of atoning for the centuries of injustices we have inflicted upon these people, end quote. From the Prime Minister down to the village councilman, everybody declared publicly that the untouchability is wrong. But in the United States, some of our highest officials declined to render a moral judgment on segregation, and some of the South publicly boasted of their determination to maintain segregation. That would be unthinkable in India. Although discrimination has not yet been eliminated in India, it is a crime to practice discrimination against an untouchable. But even without this coercion, so successfully has the government made the issue a matter of moral and ethical responsibility that no government figure or political leader on any level dare defend discriminatory practices. One could wish that we here in the United States had reached this level of morality. America must seek its own ways of atoning for the injustices that it has inflicted upon her Negro citizens. The spirit of Gandhi was very much alive in India. Some of his disciples remembered the drama of the fight for national independence, and when they look around, find no one who comes near the stature of the Mahatma. But an objective observer must report that Gandhi is not the only great figure in India's history, but his influence is felt in almost every aspect of life and public policy. The trip had a great impact upon me personally. It was wonderful to be in Gandhi's land, to talk with his son, his grandsons, his cousin, and other relatives. to share the reminiscences of his close comrades, to visit his ashram, to see the countless memorials for him, and, finally, to lay a wreath on his entombed ashes at Rajghat. We had learned a lot, but we were not rash enough to presume that we knew India, a vast subcontinent with all of its people, problems, contrasts, and achievements. I left India more convinced than ever before that nonviolent resistance was the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. It was a marvelous thing to see the dense, but without violence, it was a marvelous thing to see the amazing results of the nonviolent campaign. India won her independence, but without violence and bitterness that usually follows a violent campaign. India won her independence, but without violence on the part of Indians. The aftermath of hatred and bitterness that usually follows a violent campaign was found nowhere in India. The way of acquiescence leads to a moral and spiritual suicide. The way of violence leads to bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. But the way of nonviolence leads to redemption and the creation of the beloved community. I returned to America with a greater determination to achieve freedom for my people through nonviolent means. As a result of my visit to India, my understanding of nonviolence became greater and my commitment deeper. And so that brings us to the end of chapter 13. And again, the main thing besides some of the history of India and some of the similarities that India faced with America and the contrasting ways in which both countries were dealing with these things, besides those things, I think that the most important thing to take away from this chapter is the most important thing to take away from this chapter is that just like with the previous two chapters, that the local movements that we build, if built the right way, will gain national prominence, will gain global prominence, that they will become a part of engulfing the issues that people worlds over are dealing with. And so, again, this Dr. King is in India now and is in has went to Ghana now, and all of these things were precipitated by the struggle that he waged in Montgomery, Alabama. So let's see where we at. We went through 3 chapters. Got through 3 chapters today. Let me see, how long is this sit-in movement chapter? Let me see. Oh, damn, it's a quick chapter. It's a short chapter. Here, let's go through. We go through chapter 14, and then after chapter 14, we call it a wrap. All right, chapter 14, the sit-in movement. It's went crazy. After 4 years as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association and 5 years as a resident of Montgomery, I decided to move from Montgomery to Alabama. I decided to move from Montgomery to Atlanta. I will become co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta and thereby have more time and a better location to direct the Southwide campaigns of the SCLC. For a year, the Southern Christianship Leadership Conference had been pleading with me to give it the maximum of my time, since the time was right for expanded militant action across the South. After giving the request serious and prayerful consideration, I came to the conclusion that I had a moral obligation to give more of my time and energy to the whole South. This was only possible by moving closer to the headquarters where transportation was more flexible and time hitherto consumed in longer travel could be saved and utilized for planning, directing, and supervising. So I had the painful experience of having to leave Montgomery for Atlanta. It was not easy for me to decide to leave a community where bravery, resourcefulness, and determination had shattered the girders of the old order and weakened the confidence of the rulers, despite their centuries of unchallenged rule. It was not easy to decide to leave a city whose Negroes resisted injustice magnificently and followed a method of nonviolent struggle that became one of the glowing epics of the 20th century. I hated to leave Montgomery, but the people there realized that the call from the whole South was one that could not be denied. This was the creative moment for a full-scale assault on the system of segregation. The time had come for a bold, broad advance of the Southern Campaign for Equality. I felt terribly frustrated over my inability to retreat, concentrate, and reflect. Even when I was riding stride towards freedom, I would only take off 1 or 2 weeks at a time. After returning from India, I decided that I would take 1 day a week as a day of silence and meditation. This I attempted on several occasions, but things began to pile up so much that I found myself using that particular day as a time to catch up on so many things that had accumulated. I knew that I could not continue to live with such a tension-filled schedule. My whole life seemed to be centered around giving something out and only rarely taking something in. My failure to reflect would do harm not only to me as a person, but to the total movement. For that reason, I felt the moral obligation to do it. One of my reasons for moving to Atlanta was to meet this problem head on. I felt that I would have more time to meditate and think through the total struggle ahead. Unfortunately, however, things happened which made my schedule more crowded in Atlanta than it was in Montgomery. In 1960, an electrifying movement of Negro students shattered the placid surface of campuses and communities across the South. The young students of the South, through sit-ins and other demonstrations, gave America a glowing example of disciplined, dignified, nonviolent action against the system of segregation. Though confronted in many places by hoodlums, police guns, tear gas, arrest, and jail sentences, the students tenaciously continued to sit down and demand equal service at variety store lunch counters, and they extended their protests from city to city. Spontaneously born, but guided by the theory of nonviolent resistance, the lunch counter sit-ins accomplished integration in hundreds of communities at the swiftest rate of change in the civil rights movement up to that time. In communities like Montgomery, Alabama, the whole student body rallied behind expelled students and staged a walkout, while state government intimidation was unleashed with the display of military force appropriate to a wartime invasion. Nevertheless, the spirit of self-sacrifice and commitment remained firm, and the state governments found themselves dealing with students who had lost their fear of jail and physical injury. The campuses of Negro colleges were infused with the dynamism of both action and philosophical discussion. Even in the 30s, when the college campus was alive with social thought, only a minority were involved in action. During the sit-in phase, when a few students were suspended or expelled, more than one college saw the total student body involved in a walkout protest. This was a change in student activity of profound significance. Seldom, if ever, in American history had a student movement engulfed the whole student body of a college. Many of the students, when pressed to express their inner feelings, identified themselves with students in Africa, Asia, and South America. The liberation struggle in Africa was the great single international influence on American Negro students. Frequently, I heard them say that if their African brothers could break the bonds of colonialism, surely the American Negro could break Jim Crow. I felt we had to continue to challenge the system of segregation, whether it was in the schools, public parks, churches, lunch counters, or public libraries. Segregation had to be removed from our society, and Negroes had to be prepared to suffer, sacrifice, and even die to gain their goals. We could not rest until we had achieved the ideals of our democracy. I prayed much over our Southern situation, and I came to the conclusion that we were in a season of suffering. I urged students to continue to struggle on the highest level of dignity. They had rightly chosen to follow the path of nonviolence. Our ultimate aim was not to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding. We had a moral obligation to remind him that segregation is wrong. We protested with the ultimate aim of being reconciled with our white brothers. A period began in which the emphasis shifted from the slow court process to direct action in the form of bus protests, economic boycotts, and mass marches to and demonstrations in the nation's capital and state capitals. The most significant aspect of this student movement was that the young people knocked some of the oldsters out of their state of apathy and complacency. What we saw was that segregation could not be maintained in the South without resultant chaos and social disintegration. One may wonder why the movement started with the lunch counters. The answer lay in the fact that the Negro has suffered indignities and injustices that cannot be justified or explained there. Almost every Negro had experienced the tragic inconveniences of lunch counter segregation. He could not understand why he was welcomed with open arms at most counters in the store, but was denied service at a certain counter because it happened to be selling food and drink. In a real sense, the quote, sit-in, end quote, represented more than a demand for service. It represented a demand for respect. I was convinced that the student movement that was taking place all over the South in 1960 was one of the most significant developments in the whole civil rights struggle. It was no overstatement to characterize these events as historic. Never before in the United States has so large a body of students spread a struggle over so great an area in pursuit of a goal of human dignity and freedom. The student movement finally refuted the idea that the Negro was content with segregation. The students had taken the struggle for justice into their own hands. Negro freedom fighters revealed to the nation and the world that they had determination and courage. They were moving away from the tactics which were suitable merely for gradual and long-term change. This was an era of offensive on the part of oppressed people. All peoples deprived of dignity and freedom marched on every continent throughout the world. And we're coming to the last section in the sit-in movement chapter. But again, one of the things I just want to point out is the magnitude that Dr. King is speaking, that this movement is beginning to gain and that the struggle is beginning to gain. I again would like to point out that this is in 1960 that Dr. King is talking about the sit-in movement taking place and the tenacity and the bravery that was being displayed in the sit-in movement. But it should be remembered that it was 1954 when the Montgomery bus boycott began to take place. And so, again, we see that these things don't just happen overnight, that these dominoes being set up don't just get set up within days or within weeks or within months, but years. You have to set these dominoes up within years, and you have to do the work of it was people who were 14 and 15 years old when the Montgomery bus boycott was taking place, who are now 17, 18, 19 years old. And because of seeing the struggle that their uncles and aunts and mothers and fathers and grandmothers, grandfathers, great-grandmothers, great-grandfathers were taking part in. Now that they're students and they're going to universities, they have the consciousness to want to take part in a struggle as well. They have the consciousness to understand the things that come with taking part in that struggle, whether it be threats of physical violence, whether it be threats of state-sanctioned violence, whether it be that violence fulfilled and their lives being taken or their freedoms being taken away. They have built up the type of determination from watching the movement unfold and these struggles unfold. They built up the type of determination to be able to withstand those things. And so we have to remember that not only when we're waging these grassroots local struggles, not only is it areas that they will begin to encompass. When I say that, I mean that in Montgomery in 1954, they were waging a grassroots local struggle that would eventually, as time passed, encompass the entire globe because of what was going on in Montgomery. And then even time itself, the things that they did in 54 and 55, the way that they were waging these struggles would then have direct impacts and direct influences on the things that would happen years down the line and would mold a new generation of young people coming up. And so we have to have that same understanding that the struggles that we wage in Rockford, Illinois in 2020 will have, if waged the proper way, if waged with the proper steadfastness, will begin to encompass not just Rockford, Illinois, not just Winnebago County, Illinois, but the entirety of Illinois, the entirety of the Midwest region, and then the entirety of the nation, and then the entirety of the globe. And the same thing, that these things that this type of struggle that we're waging in 2020 and 2021 will begin to encompass people who live and who struggle in 2022 and 2023, 2024, 2025. And so it is, even though we take take it a day at a time. We have to understand that each one of these days stretches farther than any of us can truly understand. I can recall what may very well have been a turning point in my life as a participant in the Negro struggle in the South. It was the year 1960 in Montgomery, Alabama, when the glorious sit-ins at lunch counters had seized the attention of all Americans. The white Southern power structure, in an attempt to blunt and divert that effort, indicted me for perjury and openly proclaimed that I would be imprisoned for at least 10 years. This case was tried before an all-white Southern jury. All of the state's witnesses were white. The judge and the prosecutor were white. The courtroom was segregated. Passions were inflamed. Feelings ran high. The press and other communications media were hostile. Defeat seemed certain, and we in the freedom struggle braced ourselves for the inevitable. There were two men among us who persevered with the conviction that it was possible, in this context, to marshal facts and law and thus win vindication. These men were our lawyers, Negro lawyers from the North, William Meade of Chicago and Hubert Delaney from New York. They brought to the courtroom wisdom, courage, and a highly developed art of advocacy. But most important, they brought the lawyers' indomitable determination to win. After a trial of 3 days, by the sheer strength of their legal arsenal, they overcame the most vicious Southern taboos festering in a virulent and inflamed atmosphere, and they persuaded an all-white jury to accept the word of a Negro over that of white men. The jury, after a few hours of deliberation, returned a verdict of acquittal. I am frank to confess that on this occasion, I learned that truth and conviction in the hands of a skillful advocate could make what started out as a bigoted, prejudiced jury choose the path of justice. I cannot help but wish in my heart that the same kind of skill and devotion which Bill Meade and Hubert Delaney accorded to me could be available to thousands of civil rights workers, to thousands of ordinary Negroes who are every day facing prejudiced courtrooms. And that brings us to the end of the sit-in movement, chapter 14, and that brings us to the beginning of chapter 15, Atlanta arrest and presidential politics, right there. And I think what I want to reflect on chapter 14 is just that last section there, because that last section gets us into the issues of mass incarceration, even though in this moment mass incarceration was not something that was had fully manifested. I think that it's important to point out that even as far back as you go, what's up, the same tactics have consistently been used. We've read through all of these chapters how police terrorism has been something that has been being used, how racial injustice is the underlying tone and theme through all of these things that were happening in the South. But we've also seen efforts of mass incarceration. We've also seen and again, mass incarceration is not a term that's being used, and the what we know of as mass incarceration had not been implemented in the 60s. But the unjustness of incarceration is being painted here. Dr. King being tried by an all-white Southern jury. There are people to this day in 2021 who are tried by all-white juries in the South, all white juries all over this nation. And as a black person, that's not a jury of your peers. And as a black person that's going into a match handicapped. The same thing, the judge and the prosecutors being white. I just recently sat in a courtroom where I was remanded into custody, and I felt a bunch of unjust actions were taking place, and the judge and the prosecutors were white. The public defender was white. And so a lot of these things that existed in 1960, the unjustness of the court system, of the legal, the criminal justice system, these things still exist now. And it is people who are still under political persecution and dealing with these same type of things currently now in 2021 in Rockford, Illinois. And so I just think that, again, this book transcends police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. The life that Dr. King had transcends those things. He felt and dealt with all of those things in some type of a manner during his lifetime and while he was waging this struggle. And so that's just one of the other things that I feel is important for us to take away from this. And so we're getting ready to start chapter 15. I'm going to go ahead and end this live. We knocked out a nice amount of chapters today. Want to continue. This is year 2, day 2 of the occupation at City Hall. Want to continue to build upon this momentum of doing these Rockford readings daily and knocking out multiple chapters daily. So that way, hopefully, we can get to the point of maybe even doing a different book every week, depending on the size of the books. So just want to ask anybody who's watching this to please share this live. No matter when you're watching it, even if you're not watching it live. And I would ask people, go back and watch some of the previous Rockford readings from different books, including this book. And if this book is something that you're intrigued in, it's entitled The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. By Claiborne Carson. What's his name? Yeah, edited by Claiborne Carson, written by Dr. King. But please go get it on Audible or Barnes & Nobles, wherever you can find books at. We're going to end this live the way we end all the lives by saying rest in power to Demetrius Bennett, rest in power to Logan Bell, rest in power to Kerry Blake, rest in power to Mark Barmore, rest in power to Jovan Fresco, rest in power to Geno Washington, rest in power to Philip Johnson, rest in power to Suzette Babler, rest in power to Jasper Banks, rest in power to Shannon Graves, rest in power to Faustin Guetigo, rest in power to Little Mike Sago, rest in power to Mikey Guzman, rest in power to Eddie Patterson, and rest in power to Joseph McCormick. We outside.